dappled light. Dappled light really should be called dappled shadows because it's the variation of shadows that you see on sidewalks, walls, on grass. It's these very interesting shapes that are created by cast shadows from trees, fences, flowers, and actually being cast by any object. First, let's take a look at the attributes of a cast shadow. We'll take a real simple subject like this pencil casting a shadow on the ground. Here's our light source and the pencil is the object. Now you'll notice the further away the shadow gets from the object, the softer the edge becomes. In other words, the edge is more blurred. So right here is where the shadow starts. And you'll notice that the edges of the shadow are hard or sharp. And the further away the shadow gets from the object, the softer the edge gets. In other words, the edge gets more blurred. The other attribute is that the closer the shadow is to the object, the darker the shadow is. Right next to the pencil, where the shadow starts and the shadow is closest to the object, that's the area that is the darkest. And as the shadow moves away from the object, the value of the shadow raises. In other words, the shadow gets lighter and lighter. Now let's look at this more common scenario. This is a patio in my backyard. Here's our light source. The sun is shining from this direction. You'll notice that this shadow is the sharpest shadow. In other words, it has the hardest edges. And you'll notice in this shadow, the edges start to blur a bit. And then in this third shadow, the edges become softer and lighter in value. Now the reason is similar to what we saw in the pencil. This shadow is closest to this object. In other words, the leg of this planter is sitting right on the ground, so the cast shadow has a very sharp and hard edge. Now this shadow is being cast by this branch. So the object, which is the branch, is further away from the ground. And so the shadow becomes a little lighter in value and the edges become a little softer than the shadow that's being cast by the leg of the planter. Now this third shadow is being cast by a limb in a tree. So the object, which is the tree, is the furthest away from the ground of all three of these shadows. So the shadow is higher in value and the edges are softer. Now you'll notice that they're all the same color though, because they're cast shadows and they're being cast on the cement. So the actual shadows are all the same color, they just vary in value and the type of edges that they have. There are some nuances in the temperature of the shadow, but we'll go into that in a later video. Remember, the other thing that was happening with the pencil shadow is that the closer the shadow was to the object, the darker the shadow was. And you can see that here. This shadow is dark and it gets lighter as it gets further away from the object. And you can also see that this shadow is darker in value than this shadow because the branch of the tree, which is the object, is further away from the cement than the planter, which is casting the first shadow. So what I'm going to do to show you how to paint this dappled light is paint this image, and I really need to paint the whole image because you need to see this dappled light in the context of the painting. So I'll develop everything but the dappled light first, and I'll run the first part in high speed, and in the second video I'll paint the dappled light and we'll slow the video down. You've seen me do this in other paintings where I use a paper towel to wash in my large areas of color. To get this nice blue-violet or red-violet color, you mix equal parts of ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, and cadmium red. That's equal parts of ultramarine blue, cadmium red, and cadmium yellow. So right now I'm just blocking in some of the values. The brush that I'm using is a number 6. Silver Grand Prix is the brand name, and it's called a bright bristle brush. I'm not showing my palette on this because this painting is about dappled light, not about painting bushes and planters. In the next video, when I start developing the dappled light, I'll also develop these plants a little more. So this will wrap up the first video of painting dappled light. In video number 2, we'll slow the video down and we'll work on the dappled